All right, guys, let's talk about 6 reasons why you should read the King James. Good reasons. I came up with 6 reasons. I don't carry the KJV, and I don't always use the KJV. I go to a church that its primary translation is the KJV, and I have fellowship with brothers that their version that they use and depend on for their ministry is KJV. And I want to give you 6 reasons why you should read a KJV, and comes from conversations I've had with many other people, plus using it occasionally throughout the years. So the 6 reasons, let me just start out with that. Okay, so the first reason is the KJV challenges and strengthens your reading level and broadens your vocabulary. You should want to desire to broaden your vocabulary. You should want to be able to read things that maybe you wouldn't be able to read like a year ago. And if you can read the King James, it will make your, strengthen your reading level and your comprehension level. If you can read the King James and comprehend it, then you've now strengthened that. It broadens your vocabulary, of course. Back when English was a lot more dynamic of a language than it is today. And because of that one, so the first one is it strengthens your reading level. The second reason why you should read a King James is you'll have an easier time reading the writings of people who wrote centuries ago. I studied some people who wrote 100 or 200, 300 years ago, and I'm sure that some of you do too. And if you read the King James, you'll have an easier time of understanding those writings or comprehending what they said because of your reading of the King James. It won't be as unfamiliar to you as maybe some other, if you just don't read normal Bible, modern Bible translation. So again, it broadens your reading level. It allows you to go back and read those with a deeper comprehension of what they wrote. The third reason, and this one didn't make sense, this one I kind of picked up later on in ministry, it was translated in a time that didn't have the pressure of modern social political movements. There's a lot of pressure put on Bible translators, put on publishing houses of the modern day that try to push a certain agenda onto Bibles. You hear about it in a lot of people who still read the King James, a lot of gender neutrality, a lot of sexual fluidity, a lot of aiming towards a particular movement. You've got the Rainbow Bible, you've got multiple Bible translations. Now those are extreme, but even a lot of the Bible, some of the New Modern Bible translations reflect some of these political and social movements that's going on. And it's nice to know that I have a Bible in my library that was not translated during this time. It's over 400 years old. And that means a lot to me because when I read it, I know that they may have had their own biases, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. But at least I'm not reading something that clearly could have had a bias. And so it's translating time when all those pressures didn't exist, and that means a lot to me. It should mean a lot to you. Even it meant so much to me that when I was laying out the Constitution for my church plant, I actually put in there that we are a Texas Receptus church, and then I also put in there that we lean on the King James and New King James and the MEV. And the reason I put those in there, because it would be very easy for someone to pull up a more modern, new modern translation that did not say what I felt or what I knew that the text says, and so I put those translations actually in our Constitution. If the fourth reason, so that was the third reason. The fourth reason you should read the King James is you'll see why this translation has lasted 400 years and still holds a prominent place in our churches. And I'm not an old guy. I go to churches that still use strong King James churches, and I was wondering why. That when I decided to read through it and start digging into it a little bit, I realized that it is a beautiful translation, and it is something that still speaks to today, and it is something that I can appreciate. It is something that I can still use today in my studies, and I can see why it lasted 400 years. It's a beautiful translation, and I think it's going to last for many years on. The fifth reason why you should read the King James, we're at the Mission Center and someone just got pizza. The fifth reason is the KJV retains some of the grammatical structures of the original languages, where some modern translation will reorient the text for clarity. Now, this is helpful for clarity, but for the student who wants to see every word and phrase that's in the original languages without actually having to be a Hebrew or Greek scholar, the King James, what makes it a bit awkward to read is it tries to retain some of those structures that's in the original languages. And because it retains those things, makes it a little bit awkward to read, but you can kind of see the Greek and the Hebrew reflected somewhat into the English because they try to retain that in the translation. That's excellent for study. It's great for study. It's something that the New King James tried to carry on forward when they did their translation. I felt like they did a good job with it as well. But the King James does a good job, and you'll want to see that and use that. The sixth reason, and my final reason, why reading a King James right now, and you should, is because it is one of the clearest translations to show verb tenses, singular plural nouns, and pronouns, and other important grammatical distinctions. Now, when you read the King James text, you're going to find out it reads kind of odd. The text is kind of different. It has ests in it, has eths in it. It has thee and thou. It has ye and you. And you'll find out that those things are in there for a reason. They're in there not just because that's how they read back in the day. Perhaps maybe they did, I don't know. But it shows what is reflected in the original text. So you see these things, and they give you a lot more insight to the text than a modern translation will if you do not have the experience or tools necessary to dissect the original language. And I know people who've studied using the modern versions and switched over to the King James for personal study and carry because they realized that the King James text gave them tools in the text that helped them understand the original language better without having to carry around a Greek New Testament or a Hebrew Old Testament or any of the other tools. The King James was good in that way. And let me give you an example of this just to finish off the video. In 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 3, 16 through 17, this is what I'm reading this out of my MEV because it's a modern translation. It says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and you are his temple." Now, I don't know how many sermons you've heard of this. I've heard quite a few sermons over this. And I'll be honest with you, most of the sermons I heard treat this as he's talking to me as an individual. Now, some people will say, well, context clearly dictates this to the church. Yes, maybe. If you look at the verse before, it says, if anyone, that's singular, he will suffer loss, there's singular, but he himself will be saved, singular, going on through the fire. Okay? And then, verse 18, right after that, says, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be, and there's among you, and they'll say, see, that's among you. That's right. But it's not as clear as you think it is. And I know a lot of preachers who would preach this sermon and talk about how my body, my personal body, is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And they'll preach things like that's why you don't want to put trash in it by looking at bad things you ought not. That's why you don't want to eat a whole bunch of junk food. You want to treat your body as the temple of God because it is. And there might be a level of truth to that. The question is that the intention of Paul in 1 Corinthians 3? Well, you pull out your handy-dandy King James Bible, and you come to that same passage, 1 Corinthians 3. This is a new Bible, so by the way. And 1 Corinthians 3, 16 through 17 says, know ye not that ye there is plural. If you know how to use the grammatical text, you now know that he's saying, know y'all not, that you all are the temple of God, the Spirit dwelleth in you, still plural. So you, ye, and you, all plural. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple y'all are. That just gives you one example of how the King James settled something that has not always been clear to many preachers. That Paul's talking about the body of believers is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Let me read it. So, no, don't you know that the body of believers are the temple of God? Don't you know that the Spirit of God dwelleth in the body of believers? Don't you know that the Holy Spirit there And he goes, if anyone defile the temple of God, which is the body, if you defile the body of believer, if you bring sin or division or any into the body, don't you realize you're defiling God's temple, which is the body of believers, and God will destroy you? For the temple of God is holy, which temple the body of believers are. Now, that was a lot more clear in the King James. So those are 6 reasons to read the King James. I'm going to read them off real quick, but you've got all 6 if you want to go ahead and move on. It challenges strengths at your reading level. You have an easier time studying writings of people who wrote centuries ago. It was translated in a time that wasn't under the pressure of social political movements. You'll see why the King James has lasted 400 years. It still holds a prominent place. You'll see that the King James retains some of the grammatical structures of the original languages, which gives you a little better insight of what's actually being said instead of reorienting the text all the time. And the King James text is full of tools for the reader, and it gives you a picture of what's in the original language without you having to study the original language. So on that note, and if you don't want to use the King James, like, John, that's just too hard, let me recommend again the KJV. All the outdated words are either modernized with the modern equivalent, like literally, like instead of saith, it says said. It updates. It just takes away the tenses, and you can find that in the beginning of the Bible here, where it has that list of words that it changed. And again, just to kind of give you a real quick synopsis of this, it says instead of abhorrest, it's abhor. Instead of abhorreth, it's abhors. Instead of callest, it's call. So that's the kind of update they did with other archaic words, underlined with defined with the retranslate or defined with a modern equivalent at the end of the verse. And this actually puts you, but it puts a little p, where the ye would be with a little p. So you still are getting that plural and singular benefit. In the KJV, it just looks a little bit different. So you can't handle the King James. I would at least read through this. I think you'll find out that you're blessed for doing it. So on that note, you guys have a great day, and God bless.